We'll start now because all our panel speakers are here. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Greetings from the UNDP Pakistan Country Office. My name is Amara Durrani and I'm Assistant President Representative and Chief Development Policy Unit at UNDP. My colleagues and I are delighted to welcome all of you to the inaugural session of the Pakistan Inequality Debates, which is a national dialogue series based on the UNDP Pakistan National Human Development Report 2020, entitled The Three Ps of Inequality: Power, People, and Policy. The report was launched by Honorable Prime Minister, His Excellency Mr. Imran Khan, in April this year. This is the fourth NHDR report produced by UNDP Pakistan, having started our journey in 2004 with the first on poverty. Our last report came out in 2018 on Pakistan's youth demographic dividend and empowerment, and it was adopted by the government of Pakistan as its core framework for the ongoing Prime Minister's Kamyab Jawan program. So, our national human development reports are designed to produce evidence based policy paradigms. Today's session is designed less to review the report and more to advance evidence based dialogue to inform policy. A quick round of introductions of our esteemed speakers and panelists today. We are joined by Honorable Federal Minister, Planning, Development, and Special Initiatives, His Excellency Mr. Asad Umar, who is the chief guest of our session today. Welcome, sir. We are joined by Dr. Hafiz Pasha, who's the lead author of the NHDR 2020 on inequality, a former federal minister himself. Welcome, sir. Mr. Knut Ostby is the resident representative of UNDP Pakistan, representing the country office today. We are joined among the panelists, Dr. Faisal Bari, senior professor at LUMS University and an expert on the education sector, Miss Mary Gill, former parliamentarian, a lawyer, a human rights activist, and a politician of the opposition party PML-N, Dr. Sajjad Akhtar, senior professor at Quaid-e-Azam University and a lifelong rights activist, and finally, Ms. Nazish Brohi, a social sector, social scientist, researcher, and expert working on vulnerable groups and gender issues. With that, I request Resident Representative UNDP Pakistan, Mr. Knut Ostby, to formally open today's dialogue. Knut, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm very privileged and happy to be able to be part of inauguration of this first inequality debates. I think this is the value of a document like this, that it doesn't stay a document, that it becomes a basis for a dynamic debate in society. So a very warm welcome to all. In particular, a warm welcome to our Honorable Federal Minister of Planning, Development and Special Initiative, His Excellency Mr. Asad Umar, and our lead author, Dr. Hafiz Pasha. As you know, the Honorable Prime Minister of Pakistan, His Excellency Imran Khan, launched a report in April this year. And I would like to also extend my sincere gratitude to Minister Asad Umar for taking part in that launch, for taking part in the building up of this report through his leadership of the Advisory Council. And I would like to also congratulate Dr. Pasha for authoring, together with the team, such a comprehensive, complex subject of inequalities in Pakistan. Many thanks also to the esteemed panel members for joining us, taking your time and leading this national discussion on the theme of people as drivers of inequality, leaving no one behind. The aim, I think, as Amar already said, is to engage in a debate that includes people from all walks of life on how we may combat inequality. I'd like to recall the origins of the Human Development Report, which comes from Pakistan's very own Dr. Mahbub ul Haq, who produced the first International Human Development Report in 1990. This was actually the first year that I worked for UNDP, and I remember with great pride to see how these concepts have evolved and how it has introduced something people-oriented instead of just mathematics and economics as a measurement of how a country and a group of people progress. And this is also a very useful way to look at inequality and why the concept of people is so central to inequality. For example, COVID-19 has affected people from all walks of life, but it has not affected everybody in society equally. It is different across Pakistan in terms of infection impact, access to medical care, and access to vaccination. But fortunately, Pakistan has been able to ensure that vaccinations are open for people from all walks of life, which shows the importance of a policy first. There's also another dimension of the link between inequality and people. We do not only need to pay attention to the people that are that inequality happens to. It is also the people who create inequality by beliefs, by their actions. And yet another dimension is that people are also the drivers of removing inequality, of creating inclusion, combating inequality, and that can best be done by people being empowered, people being able to contribute, people being able to take part in society as drivers of development, and not just as subjects. Within the NHDR 2020, people as drivers of inequality refers to the deeply embedded belief system that encourage bias against marginalized groups. We hope to explore these themes and criticality in our discussion with a special focus on Pakistan's vulnerable communities, including women, youth, children, minorities, and other marginalized groups. This is an important focus for UNDP's Pakistan program as part of our commitment to achieve the promise of Agenda 2030, to leave no one behind. At the same time, people also present an opportunity for Pakistan. Again, recalling Dr. Mahbub ul Haq's wise words when he stated that the real wealth of a country is its people. As the 5th most populous country of the world, therefore, Pakistan has an opportunity to leverage its demographic dividends into force multipliers for sustainable development and green growth. This is how Pakistan can take a bold leap forward towards a sustainable, inclusive, and equal future. I'm deeply encouraged by the public response and public discourse that the NHDR 2020 has already ignited in Pakistan, and I hope today's dialogue will deepen both public and policy interest to use the report's data and recommendations for betterment of the country. As Pakistan's steadfast development and policy partner, we in UNDP look forward to continuing to support the government in achieving its mandate of mitigating inequality, poverty alleviation, and human development for all, and to move towards a more equal Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Knut, thank you very much for your welcome and objective remarks. May I request lead author of NHDR 2020, Dr. Hafiz Pasha, to now present his overview with a focus on the people component. Dr. Pasha, over to you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Honorable Federal Minister for Planning and Special Initiatives, Honorable Resident Representative of the United Nations Development Program in Pakistan, and also the panelists, let me start by saying that the fundamental point that I'd like to start with is that our 1973 Constitution enshrines the vision of a functioning democracy and a social welfare state. And I would like very quickly to quote, perhaps to me, one of the most important clauses of the Constitution, which is Article 38A, which very clearly states, secure the well-being of the people irrespective of sex, caste, creed, or race by raising their standard of living, by preventing the concentration of wealth and means of production and distribution in the hands of a few to the detriment of general interest, and by ensuring equitable adjustment of rights between employer and employees and landlords and tenants. And the further sub-article says, reduce disparity in the income and earnings of individuals. This to us is like the gospel, and we take it very seriously. And this has been the prime motivation behind my team's dedication over the last 1 year or so in preparing this human development report. The Honorable Prime Minister was gracious enough to launch our report, and he made an outstanding statement at the end of that launch. And one of the themes which he has consistently emphasized is the theme of what he calls the two different Pakistans. And I would like to give a manifestation of this acute difference between people living in different parts of the country. Take the income example. The top quintile in Sindh, mostly concentrated in the city of Karachi, have a PPP income of $16,886 annually, and that corresponds to the average for China. So at least one island of affluence in this country has reached China's standard. But look at the bottom, the people at the bottom quintile of Balochistan, only annual income of $1,609, close to a country which has been bedeviled with strife for decades. And the ratio between the top urban Sindh quintile and the bottom Balochistan quintile is 10.5 to 1. I mean, this really manifests the Prime Minister's theme of the two different Pakistans. And clearly the objective of policy must be that while both grow, the bottom grows faster and catches up. I'd like to highlight some of the kind of share and the preemption that has taken place in our country by perhaps the most affluent households of the country, what we call the richest 1% of the population. In terms of bank deposits, they have a share of 38%. In terms of income tax payments, 30%. In terms of the total net income, 1% has 9% share of the national household income. Now, a very striking statistic revealed by the agricultural census of 2010, that the 1% of the top farmers have 22% of the land area. And finally, the property share is 16%, living in posh urban neighborhoods, the top 1% of the population. So this highlights the acute inequality which we observe at the top of the income pyramid, and sometimes this has been referred to in the literature as elite capture. Now let me turn to the different quintiles of household, the people living in Pakistan in different quintiles. How do they fare in terms of their share in the national household income? We have adjusted for underreporting in the household integrated economic surveys, and we find that the top quintile preempts 50% of the household income. And the lowest quintile hardly manages to get a share of 7% of the household income in the country. The difference is magnified by income, particularly from financial assets and foreign remittances. The ratio, the so-called Palma modified ratio, which shows the ratio between the top quintile and the bottom quintile, reveals a ratio of 7 to 0.1, which is high by international standards. We have a very interesting causality or relationship, which could be two-way, between growth and inequality. And we have studied very carefully virtually the better part of Pakistan's history. And we had to do a lot of primary research for this from 1958 to 2019. And one conclusion stands out, and that is that by and large, high growth periods tend to be accompanied by rising inequality. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. Whereas low growth periods, fortunately, at least there is a bottom in the sense that poverty tends to decline. However, there are certain periods where we have observed this relationship does not hold up. But by and large, and this is consistent with the finding in international literature, that there may be a negative relationship between growth and inequality, and that clearly the whole focus of inclusive and sustainable growth has to be to ensure that this relationship becomes somehow the other positive. The other indication is the difference between the different income levels. We have the high human development level of Pakistan, which approaches 0.7. I mean, this is almost close to a developing country's human development index, whereas unfortunately, the lowest 1/3 of the population are down to 0.42, which places them below sometimes many of the least developed countries in the world. This is an important finding. We did research on estimating the regional economies of Pakistan at the provincial level. This was a lot of primary research, and fortunately I had 2 of my PhD students working on this. And we were able to derive what has been the growth rate per capita in the 4 provinces of our country, and the results are extremely important, and I would like to quickly highlight them. The fastest growth is in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, over 5% per annum, whereas the national average is about 4.3. And the increase in per capita income is 2.1%. This is from over the last 20 years or so. The other province which has done moderately well is Sindh, 4.5, particularly in the earlier years of this century, and Punjab, 4.2. The real worrying case is the fact that over this 2-decade period, we have seen no increase in the real per capita income of Balochistan. It has fallen by about 0.5% annually, particularly because its population growth is somewhat higher. And clearly, it is indeed very appropriate that our government today is focusing on the issues of development of Balochistan, and many changes are being made to facilitate this process. The government's been very responsive. Very quickly, let me highlight the varying levels of development and the rates of growth. The 2 provinces, Sindh and Punjab, have come very close to each other in terms of the level of human development, very close, medium level. Both have had a growth rate of 8.5. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is the star performer. Now it's come very close to the other 2 provinces, and of course, it still remains at a somewhat low level of human development, but it's catching up fast and has shown a cumulative growth of 11.2% in the last 12 years. Balochistan, as I've already highlighted, has not been able to show much improvement. I would like to highlight some research which has been done for the first time in the special regions of our country. The first is Pakistan-administered Kashmir. The other is Gilgit-Baltistan. We did FATA, but since FATA has now been merged into KPK, we are trying to actually do the combined estimation. The very positive result and very striking result is that Pakistan's administered Kashmir has a human development education higher than anywhere else in Pakistan. The people of Kashmir have done very well. And this is something which we are very proud to highlight. The literacy rate in Kashmir is 72%. And it has done exceptionally well, partly also because of the support over the last many, many years of remittances from their workers abroad. So this is an exceptional performer, and we thought we should highlight the achievements of Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Gilgit-Baltistan, of course, needs to catch up, is slightly ahead of Balochistan, but not much. We have constructed for the first time in the literature on human development, and this I'm proud to say is a follow-up to the work done by Pakistan's most distinguished economist, Dr. Mehboob ul Haq. And I'm pleased to say, if I may be slightly personal, that the Mehboob ul Haq Award instituted by the Anglo Corporation, of which Mr. Asad Umar was at one time the president, I was awarded the Mehboob ul Haq Lifetime Achievement Award, so I thought I'd contribute to this process. We have constructed for the first time 4 indices highlighting the standards of living and the quality of life of 4 important groups in our society: children, youth, labor, and of course, women. And let me tell you that this has been extremely enriching, this work, and it is first time in the literature on human development that such indices have been constructed, not looking at the entire population, but looking at particular groups in society. On the Child Development Index, Pakistan has a level which is slightly above the low middle level. Youth development, surprisingly, we do somewhat better, and that is the reason why the last generation of our youth have been endowed with somewhat better education facilities, and the illiteracy rate at the margin in Pakistan has become significantly higher, and that is reflected in the Youth Development Index. Unfortunately, the labor index is very low, very much in the low domain, and the principal reason for this is the virtual absence of decent work as defined by ILO in the labor community of Pakistan. And the fact that a majority of workers are in the informal sector, and we have seen, unfortunately, the predicament that they had to face after COVID-19. Here again, the government did a stellar job through its social protection to redeem and save jobs, and the State Bank did an excellent job too. Pakistan is one of the lowest rankings in the world in gender inequality, and this is clearly an area where we stand low and we will need to improve. Finally, let me come to the ground level research. I mean, we went all over the country and we conducted 38 focus group discussions across the country, including Punjab, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and so on, and the newly merged districts. And we interviewed over 500 members of marginalized communities, including Afghan migrants, bonded labor, displaced persons, informal workers in various minority communities, and so on. And the findings are important because they reflect the concern of particular groups of people in our society who our constitution demands and asks for equal treatment and improvement in their quality of lives. Let me just highlight some of the areas of difficulty. Women, refugees, and displaced persons and laborers all express dissatisfaction with access to essential services, including health in particular, has been a problem. And here again, I must say that the government has taken a big initiative in this budget to have a health card, more or less, in the entire country. The transgender community is most unhappy with issues of representation. And women and persons with disabilities are most concerned about the lack of employment opportunities. And it's very important that the final results of the population census which came out have given us an idea about the size of these minority groups in Pakistan. Unfortunately, our youth has tended to suffer from somewhat lack of optimism. Maybe this is because the pressure of the demographic bulge has led to some degree of idle youth. There are almost 5 million idle youth in this country, and we need to really focus on youth. And as was highlighted by Amara, the youth initiative Kamyab Jawan program has been taken up aggressively by the government. Let me conclude by thanking you for this hearing, and let me in particular thank Mr. Asad Umar, our Honorable Minister, who took so much interest in this preparation of this Human Development Report, chaired the Advisory Council, and effectively guided us. Thank you once again, Mr. Asad Umar, and I would like to acknowledge the efforts of my very, very efficient and committed team who did a stellar job in preparing this report, which I hope, inshallah, will continue to be useful to the people of Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasha, for setting a solid context for today's dialogue and debate on inequality, focusing on the people component. Without further ado, may I request our session's chief guest, His Excellency Federal Minister Planning, Mr. Asad Umar, to please share his thoughts with the audience today. So over to you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Obviously, I'd like to start first of all by thanking UNDP for selecting this topic because I think it's a topic which is extremely important for Pakistan and has been, unfortunately, a serious issue facing Pakistan and continues to be one of the more important issues that Pakistan needs to deal with. We cannot say enough about the contribution made by Dr. Hafiz Pasha. I keep on saying this. I'm sure I annoy some people also. In my mind, the top economists in Pakistan today, and him taking out his time and putting in the effort despite his health issues that he had been facing a while back. So I really want to appreciate the effort put in by Dr. Hafiz Pasha. Okay, so in the way I look at it, I divide the challenge of inequality in Pakistan on two different lines. One is what I call the vertical inequality, and I'll talk about what the government is trying to do in that domain, and then I will talk about what I describe as horizontal inequality. Both are extremely important in my mind. The vertical obviously refers to the income differentials in the different quintiles that the report has also highlighted, that everybody is familiar with. And that inequality is being addressed, or the government is attempting to address that inequality through two different strands. One is the social protection part of it. SAS obviously is an extremely important component of that, but as alluded to by Dr. Hafiz Pasha, the health card or the health insurance which has been introduced, it was first done in the previous term of the PTI government in KP and is now being spread across the rest of the country, is also an extremely important component of it, because if you look at the studies on inequality in Pakistan or on poverty in Pakistan, it shows that large number of people get thrown below the poverty line through for one of two reasons. One, either you'll go through one of our recurring macroeconomic stabilization programs, and that program will create a squeeze which pushes people below the poverty line. And the second one is if there is a health emergency in the country, or a health emergency in a family, or a natural disaster which is faced by them. It is a significant contributor to families being thrown into poverty, and therefore this health insurance being available, in our opinion, will play hopefully a significant part in reducing the number of people going below the poverty line, and therefore reducing inequality. Dr. Pasha showed a very interesting chart which showed a negative correlation in Pakistan between growth and equality, and high growth seems to be accompanied by higher degree of inequality. Again, as a layman, not as an economist, to me it seems to be the product of the kind of growth that we have achieved. It's almost always been consumer-led growth, consumption-led growth. It has concentrated wealth in a few hands. Land prices go through the roof. Stock prices will go up. So those who have assets, those who have means do very, very well. And those who don't really don't benefit from that at all. So the growth, and that's the second integral part of the strategy of the government, or what is being attempted, is to achieve growth which is not just sustainable, but it is based on focusing on the productive sectors and focusing on sectors in particular with high employment intensity. So the largest employer in Pakistan of any sector is by far agriculture. That dwarfs everything else. And therefore, all the effort that has gone into agriculture and correcting the pricing imbalance, which was there as well, has resulted in, if you look at the GNP valuation numbers for farm income, it has increased very, very substantially. The crop sector, the GNP increase is about 4 times, almost 5 times more in these last 3 years than the cumulative improvement of the previous 5 years. So from 2013 to 2018, the value addition increase was X, and the value addition increase in the last 3 years alone is 5X almost. So that is one significant, obviously, sector where you can, and I've been saying this for a very long time, you don't solve the problem of agriculture in Pakistan, you're not going to address poverty in Pakistan. A second issue relates to construction, because the largest employer sector in the urban part of the country is construction, and therefore the special emphasis on construction. And the PM directly leading that initiative, and including having to negotiate personally with the IMF MD and getting exemptions from the IMF program for the construction sector specifically. And that's started to kick in, and the numbers on the construction side are starting to look better and better as we move forward. And therefore, there's an employment impact that will be created. It's already been created, but will strengthen as we move forward. In the industrial sector, the largest employer is textile. There's a opinion in the country that we need to move on from textile, and we need to move towards higher tech, higher value-added sectors of the economy, which is a good thing. But the reality is today is textile is the largest employer of industrial labor in Pakistan, and therefore, if textile is not doing well, it creates problems like what we saw about 5 years back in Faisalabad, where a large number of people were being laid off and machinery was being sold. So a focused textile incentive package put in, and you've seen the results. Almost every Pakistani company is expanding in textile. And there were reports even of labor shortages being, skilled labor shortages being experienced in the textile companies in Faisalabad. So a very concentrated, very focused strategy on concentrating on those sectors which have the highest employment impact. The last part of this sectoral approach is the promotion of digital commerce. Digital commerce actually has a significant potential impact, both on the vertical inequality as well as the horizontal ones, and I'll talk about it. But we have seen a very large number of low middle class Pakistani youth, educated, getting gainful employment through selling their services and products through the digital commerce platform, and therefore all the investment that is going into both the infrastructure as well as the policy changes, particularly led by the State Bank of Pakistan, are focused on this area, and we are starting to see that the impact of that. for many years, we kept on talking about the potential of Pakistan's IT industry and its export potential, and the potential stayed at a discussion of potential and didn't really see a movement. In the first 10 months of this year, there was a 46% increase in IT sector exports from Pakistan. So very, very substantial growth is starting to come in there. So we believe that this growth strategy focused on productive sectors of the economy, particularly those sectors which create high employment, will go towards reducing the inequality that we are seeing in the country, and ensuring that the benefits of growth are seen by all the quintiles of the economy, not just the top quintile. The budget 2021-22 is also built around the same theme. There are questions which obviously there will always be questions which will be raised about any particular policy, but I don't think there is any doubt about the intent of the policy and the direction that the finance minister has tried to bring, and that is directly empowering people at the lower end of the economic income spectrum, and coming up with policies which both allow wealth creation and asset ownership in that class, plus skill development and employment generation, entrepreneurship across the board. 5 different initiatives, all designed to directly address and get significant financial resources and opportunities in the hands of 4 million families who are at the lower end of the income spectrum right now. So shifting to the second part, which is horizontal inequality, and that's also a very serious concern in Pakistan, and Dr. Pasha also showed the numbers for that. There is tremendous inequality between different regions in Pakistan. And frankly, if Karachi and Lahore and Islamabad believe that they can have prosperous, peaceful lives while significant parts of the country wallow in poverty, and where the youth see neither any income nor even any opportunities, then that's a pipe dream which is never going to be true. Therefore, it is in the interest of all Pakistanis, not just the people living in those parts of the country which have high levels of poverty, low levels of human development, but it is in the interest of even Dr. Hafiz Pasha and Asad Umar that we address the development needs of these people. And that's why last year we introduced, from what I can recall for the first time, an approach which was designed to do not just individual development projects or projects in a particular sector, but we said we picked regions and we said we'll do an integrated development strategy for the entire region. So the first one we worked on was South Balochistan. 9 districts of South Balochistan, that's some of the poorest, least developed districts of Pakistan, extreme poverty, extremely low levels of development, absence of opportunity, and therefore no surprise, the districts from where most of the terrorism-related activity has originated in the last 2 to 3 years has been that part of Pakistan. Maybe if I was in their place, I would perhaps be equally unhappy. So we did that, and in that development of that package, I just kept forcing our guys to go back and say, you have to put the people at the center of this development strategy. The development outcome has to directly be measured by the welfare it creates for the citizen, the jobs that it creates, the connectivity that it creates for them. Otherwise, if I just go with numbers, I can just do the highway from Gwadar to Turbat to Hosab and onwards, and that will be tens of billions of rupees. But most of the benefit of that will be to people who are actually not living in that area. That's just a transport connectivity which is being created. So for me, creating the connection between Turbat and Mand or to Mashkel is far more important for the welfare of the people living in that area, and revisiting things like not allowing internet connectivity in those areas because of insurgency. And I kept on arguing that perhaps there is insurgency in those areas because they don't have these opportunities. So I'm very pleased that policy has been revisited. Those areas are being connected. Special emphasis on creating, and this is what I was talking about, digital commerce. For those of you who have visited that area, and I made sure that I went personally to places like Avaran, Turbat, Khuzdar, and unless you go there, you cannot try and you cannot understand the development challenge that is there. There is very little opportunity for agriculture. There is clearly, you can't have competitive industry there. And that's where technology comes in. That's where digital commerce comes in. A kid, there is absolutely no reason to believe that a kid in Khuzdar or Avaran is any less talented than any kid who's born in New York or Boston or Karachi or Lahore. And if you create the connectivity, if you put the infrastructure in and you put in, give the person the skills and not just leave them at that, handhold them and connect them with the markets, they'll generate income for themselves sitting right there, and they can be as competitive. For that work to be done, it really is almost immaterial which city of the world you're sitting in. So that's the kind of approach that we have been taking. The last part that I'll just talk about briefly is the approach that we took to COVID, both in terms of the initial decision making, where we were castigated by the intelligent thinking people of Pakistan for taking risks, and I was constantly told that you'll have blood on your hands and you're going to be killing people. But the appreciation that a lockdown means something very different for me versus what it does for a wage earner who only makes money and puts food on the table if he goes to work that particular day, the famous dihadidar, as we call them. So from that approach to the vaccination, I frankly, we don't even think about it much. I was reading Muhammad Hanif's article and Jung for BBC, and it hit me that, yeah, that's what we've done. That it's not the norm in Pakistan that a 61-year-old poor person will have priority in access for vaccine versus a 59-year-old planning minister who's chairing the NCOC and who's also the COVID procurement, vaccine procurement committee chairman of the cabinet. So we took an approach where we said all Pakistanis are equal, not just on paper, but in terms of the policies that are decisions that are taken. And many of the different aspects, because we talked a lot about the people, but in terms of who exercises power, how that power is distributed, what are the policies which are framed, if we genuinely start living up to the ideals given in the 73 Constitution, it's a very, very progressive Constitution, and we have to thank the people who framed that Constitution. It's a very, very progressive document. And if we start living up to that, then hopefully we will start to make a more significant dent in inequality in the country. And as we know, as economists now tell us, that high inequality is actually anti-growth also. So in the long run, growth and reduction in inequality will be positively correlated, not negatively correlated. So thank you very much. I have to now rush to my cabinet. I'm sorry I took a bit more of the time than I was supposed to. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Pasha, once again. Thank you, UNDP, for organizing this.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your precious time. And we know that you have to rush to the cabinet meeting. Thank you very much for presenting a solid business case and argument for the government trying to reset the economic policy direction. We wish you could stay with us to listen to other panel speakers, but we understand you have prior commitments, more pressing commitments. So thank you very much, sir. With this, we now turn to our robust, dynamic panel of speakers and experts who have been patiently listening to key perspectives presented by Dr. Pasha first, and then Honorable Federal Minister, Mr. Asad Umar, on how the government is addressing structural and thematic inequalities. I want to start the dialogue, the debate, by posing my first question to Ms. Mary Gill, who is kind of a trailblazer in the sense that, as far as I understand and know, she's the first one to put on the national map and the national imagination the fundamental question of human dignity. We heard in Dr. Pasha's presentation and also in the minister's speech, usage of words like belief systems, value systems, cognitive biases. The minister used very interesting terminology of intent of policy making, and then putting people at the center and getting rid of indignities. Mary, based on your experience representing, a major minority group of Pakistan, your own lived experience as a parliamentarian, as a lawyer, as a human rights activist, and leading an international award-winning campaign to restore dignity and rights of sanitation workers in Pakistan. How do you look at the inherent question of social attitudes, even if you're able to achieve perfect economy and equality of incomes? What about social attitudes? How do you see that in the frame of inequality?
Thank you very much, Amara. It is such an honor to be part of this prestigious panel, and I'm very thankful to UNDP and Dr. Pasha for your tremendous efforts to bring and include those minority groups in your report. Of course, they are part and parcel of Pakistan, but somehow this is what we feel that they are, to start with, when we talk about religious minorities, we see it as a homogeneous group. So this is one thing that needs to be understood. If we really want to understand the context and background of religious minorities, they are fairly less than 4% of the total population, and the population interestingly has decreased as compared to 1998 census and this current census 2017, which the data of religious minorities was recently released. But when we talk about religious minorities, it's some of the minorities, they are privileged. This report has not just clubbed it with ethnic minorities. This is sort of somehow when we look at those graphs, somehow that their socioeconomic condition might have confused with those.
I think Mary, please go on, Mary.
Can you hear me properly?
Yes, please go on.
So when we talk about those marginalized minorities, they face the discrimination they face. It is multi-layered. So this is not just religion. Our society and our constitution, our state has a religious fabric, and that is perfectly fine. But in terms of resources, in terms of access to basic amenities, it looks like that they are at the lowest ladder of the social exclusion. And apart from religion, that caste-based discrimination and that discrimination is not faced by any other religious group. So those two particular religious groups, those are scheduled caste Hindus and Christians in particular. They not only face that discrimination, which we often quote as religious discrimination, but that caste-based discrimination. They both mainly come from low caste backgrounds. And despite the fact that Pakistan denies existence of caste-based discrimination, these both communities suffer from attitudes like untouchability, which by default excludes them from social life. Their highest representation is menial labors like sanitation, domestic work, and bonded labor in form of bricklaying and agri workers. And somehow all of them are seen as modern form of slavery. So this report mentions that people do not want to hire a Christian, but it overlooks the fact that particularly in case of sanitation workers, Christians are mainly required as sweepers. And in some cases, their representation in the workforce is 90%, and in other cases, it may go up to 100%. The research we did in shame and stigma in sanitation, our respondents were of the view, more than 90% said that people believe, their perception is that sanitation work should only be done by Christians. And this is no surprise that how this word chura, which is a caste-based derogatory word, sanitation worker and Christian has become interchangeably, in our colloquial language. So this is, but not just religion and that caste-based discrimination, but the third layer, and an important one in terms of inequality, is that they're poor. They are one of the poorest communities. They live in ghettos, slums, or illegal settlements in both urban or rural areas, with almost no access to basic amenities like safe drinking water or sanitation. And most importantly, they do not have proprietary rights to the places they live in. They're young girls and boys, they're more vulnerable and prone to violence, and that fear in pressured neighborhoods has increased. So it is in this context that needs to be understood in order to assess people-centric inequalities faced by marginalized minorities, and particularly these minorities. The other three group of minorities, they are not just privileged, but somehow they even become more influential in terms of their social, economic, educational, and political spheres. So I think that context is very important, and in terms of understanding this, we need to take into consideration that how the Constitution and the social attitudes have not been able to remove those inequalities or even talk about it.
Thank you very much, Mary. You've touched upon a number of critically profound issues. Discrimination and discrepancies within the minority cohorts in Pakistan, and then the question of shame and stigma and societal downgrading, whether it is connected to economic level or not. This question of stereotyping certain population segments and then basing decisions and behaviors on that kind of stereotyping is another form of inequality, which goes at the heart of the perpetuation of societal and political structures. And on this, I want to turn to Dr. Faisal Bari of LUMS, who has been consistently advocating and researching on the education sector of Pakistan, which really is the bedrock of where Pakistan's children are trained to think and to aspire. Dr. Faisal, I was looking at the federal budget 2021-22 figures. The minister also referred to this year's federal budget. It's very interesting that the figures reveal that the current expenditure, which is the non-developmental expenditure, remains almost 8 times higher than development expenditure, which of course also covers, essential social protection areas like education and health. And then our education spending remains below 1.5. And interestingly, this government seems to have allocated more resources to the social protection sector, represented by flagship programs like SAS, which the minister also alluded to. And somehow the education and health sectors, there seems to be a distinction between social protection and sectors like education in terms of allocation of resources. And so Pakistan's human development ranking stays the same. It has stayed the same for the last few years at 154 out of 189 countries of the world. So when you look at the aspiration for growth, when you look at the aspiration of people-centered development, jobs, technology as a great equalizer, how is the education sector catering to these aspirations, as well as how is the education sector failing the profound behavioral societal challenges that Mary has alluded to? Dr. Faisal.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Big question. Do you have a couple of hours for the answer? Let me just begin by saying Dr. Pasha started by quoting the Constitution. I'll also start from there. So Article 25A, which was added as part of the 18th constitutional amendment, very clearly states that the state shall provide free and compulsory education to all 5 to 16-year-olds. And this is part of the basic rights section of the Constitution. So हम अपने तमाम बच्चों से, we are promising them at least 10 years of education. And yet, if you look at the last 11 years, so this was passed in April 2010, and it's not the first time that this became part of the basic rights section, but previous to that, we have acts and other provisions in the law that talked about universal education, at least at primary and then middle level, etc. But in the last 11 years, no government, none of the provincial, none of the local or federal government have done anything to give us a plan of how 25A is going to be implemented. I don't know what can be more cruel, putting such a constitutional amendment through, which was very laudable, but doing nothing about it in the next 11 years, not even making plans for it, not even saying that we will do this over the next 15, 20 years. To me, that's a very, very strong statement that successive governments have made about not giving any priority to education. And I think that shows in both the expenditures and the outcomes that we see, right? If you look at, there are 3 or 4 standard ways of looking at education, you might say. You can talk about access, you can talk about quality, you can talk about the equity issues within education. In all of these, you know that I have seldom seen a more divided and fragmented education system in any other country as we see in Pakistan. Fragmented and divided by language, by access, by geography, by gender, by caste, by religion, any sort of cleavage that you see in society, our education system is divided along those lines as well. And that, more than anything else, is not only entrenching inequality, but it is over successive generations actually making it much worse. So if you look at a recent book, for example, I think Do Pakistan Naam Hai, the book was recently published. It makes the argument that there is a minority, like in Mughal times, there is a minority that lives within the fort and so has access to better services, whether health, education, or otherwise. And then there's a vast majority that lives outside the fort, jaise Mughal time pe hota tha, and in the rural parts of the country that has almost no access. And it's not just access to services, it's also your political influence, it's also your ability to save, whether human capital or in terms of other capital. All of these are divided by this sort of notion of who's living within the fort. So majority of Pakistanis live outside of the fort. Look at our educational system and you will get a very good feel for that. There's a 2-3% maybe proportion of children that go to what we call elite private and public schools, whether it be HSNs or cadet colleges and the beacon houses, etc. And then there is 95-96% of our enrolled children. I'm not even talking about those who are not coming to schools at all, but about 95% of enrolled children that either go to public government schools, low to middle fee private schools, or madrasas. All of them together get access to extremely poor quality education in general. And what we don't have is, over the last many years, any large initiatives that have been launched to address these. The question is not, are there initiatives? There are many initiatives that have been done. There's been tremendous reform in the education sector in provinces in the last 10, 15 years, but at a very, very small level, not to address this larger issue of getting every child access to 10 to 12 years of quality education. Even today in the minister's conversation, I found that there was a due emphasis on skill formation, but not on education, access to skills, etc. But you can't give skills unless you have some level of education at least. Look at TEVTA and other people's, all the ads that they give for candidates when they're looking for training. They say कि कम से कम metric हो, कम से कम 8वीं की हो, कम से कम ये की. So where are those good people going to come from if you don't provide education to all children at least to a certain level? And then, so that's one side. The issue of what kind of education we are giving, that also is very important, as increasingly it is becoming clear that in the issues of rote learning, in the issue of how curriculum is being set and what kind of curriculum is being set, diversity in terms of the kind of questions that Ms. Gill talked about, how do you build that into our education system? Actually, my own feeling is over the past many years, we've gone in the other direction. We have continued to make the mainstream narrower rather than broader. And so in one way, I'll take this as a strong statement, but in one way, every Pakistani today is a minority. Now there are no more majorities in Pakistan. It doesn't matter who you are. You are in one way or the other a minority. And we have worked on making that mainstream narrower and narrower over time. And therefore, everything becomes that results from that education. The result is more inequities, more fragmentation, and leads to, of course, more differences between the people rather than bringing it together. And the differences, as I said, any cleavage that you can think of in our society, caste, religion, gender, geography, age, anything that you can think of, our system is divided along all those lines. I don't know if that addresses the question that you had, Mr. Rani.
Thank you, Dr. Faisal Bari. Some excellent observations, including your pertinent observation about the government's focus on skill development as articulated by the minister vis-a-vis the need for real education. And you also made a very important point, in my view, how very interesting point, and that's a very solid social commentary on the direction of Pakistan as a nation, that our mainstream is narrowing down. That's a very pertinent observation, and you've illustrated that through examples in the education sector. I want to turn to our friend Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, who has been looking at questions of inequality, essentially people power policy, the whole themes from a very unique lifelong articulation and practice experience focusing on land ownership. Aasim has been at the forefront of a number of people's movements which center around the question of land-based income and wealth inequality in Pakistan. And that is, by the way, one of the key findings of our NHDR report, that land-based income and wealth inequality is the highest in Pakistan. So apart from the behavioral discrepancies and the educational system discrepancies, really it comes down to ownership of wealth and land. And Aasim, you heard the minister talk about how this government, especially the prime minister, is really focusing on the construction sector and also the agriculture sector, because they believe that unless structural interventions are made on these land-based sectors, poverty will not go away. You also held last week a very interesting people's conference in Islamabad, which I think touched upon alternative viewpoints to the government's or the policymakers' view of land and wealth inequality. Your thoughts, please, Aasim.
Thank you very much for having me. I've been listening very intently, and I was very glad to hear Miss Mary Gill sort of bring in her 2 cents. I've had the opportunity to work for a couple of decades now with Kachiyabadi residents all over this country, including in this Islamabad the Beautiful. And as she rightfully pointed out, and this sort of is the beginnings of a response to what you've asked, Amara, the questions of discrimination and second-class citizenship are directly correlate with questions of control over assets, over land in this case. So we have these, and then to take it to Faisal's point, we have these essentially two Pakistans divided by a wall. And sort of, let's say in this case, urban, the urban poor, and then if you add on to that various other sort of layers of inequality, where including, let's say, religious, confessional identity, gender, and there's successive gradations, and then there's a wall dividing them. And on the one hand is the poor ghetto, which, mind you, is a ghetto from which you can be evicted at any time. The only reason you're not evicted is, frankly, because elite groups need your services, as was pointed out, because you are constrained to work within particular sectors, particularly as sanitation workers. More generally, you talked about what we did over this weekend. We had people from anywhere from Gwadar to Thar to Gilgit-Baltistan, all of the many geographical peripheries of this country, and as well as metropolitan Pakistan. So people coming in from the Karachi-Hyderabad superhighway, where massive dispossession is being undertaken under the guise of a big elite, well, at least it's marketed to the middle class housing scheme. Similarly in Karachi's urban centers, in Gujarnala and Orangi Nala, all over this country, dispossession is proceeding apace. And so, this question of inequality then, with all due respect, becomes a bit moot if we are just consistently reproducing inequality and exacerbating inequality by taking away what livelihoods and land sort of, historically oppressed or exploited communities have at their disposal. One of the other things that we also discussed this past weekend in our conference was the fact that, especially in geographical peripheries, and even if you come into urban, very congested, densely populated areas, there are always some parts of the city or the village, or broadly sort of the general ecosystem, which are shared. Which may be owned privately, may even be considered state property, but this idea of common property, right, where pastoralists will take their livestock, where in the case of children, you might even be allowed to play, and those are being subjected to enclosures, right? I mean, literally land is being enclosed, water bodies are being enclosed, mountainous highlands are being enclosed. So you have, we on the street, people talk about mafias, right? In this country, it's commonplace to talk about mafias. You have land mafias, you have timber mafias, and so if there is really to be any meaningful discussion about the people who are being left behind, it's impossible to talk about this meaningfully without, as I think your report makes very clear, about the politics of it. Some of the statistics in the report you guys have put out are pretty clear, pretty damning, right? Where 20% of the population controls 50% of the assets. And with all due respect to Dr. Hafiz Pasha, I mean, there's so much more that is undocumented that could probably push those statistics, make them even look even more acute. And so, anyone, and in this report, it's quite clear, corporate elites, landed elites, military elites, they're all part of this regime, what I would call a regime of dispossession, where you are consistently pushing people already on the margins further to the wall, sometimes dispossessing them, sometimes denying them of whatever limited access to sort of common property that they may have. And then what's left is, once they're evicted from their geographical peripheries, sometimes even due to things like, the war on terror has generated a lot of displacement. They come into cities. Here, they don't have access to very highly priced, urban land. And we had a case where we worked 6 years ago in the I-11 sector of Islamabad. where people have been living in a kachi abadi, working in the mandi for 30 years, and they were bulldozed brutally under the guise of security and terrorism. So there's any number of related themes that one could get into, but it's basically a political phenomenon that we're dealing with. And the communities that you're saying are being left behind are essentially have no political voice. And this elite nexus, which is reproducing inequality, is essentially uninhibited. And one of the things which, you know, I'm sure Faisal could also speak to in his capacity as an economist, or Dr. Pasha could as well, is the fact that land is increasingly financialized, right? So now it's an asset that has some speculative future value. And so if there's a community of 5,000 people living in the city in Kachi Abadis, that land, so to speak, is being wasted. Because if you kick them off and you subdivide it into sort of some kind of gated housing community, then you know speculators could earn a lot more money. So for me, the question is about dispossession and the forces and the processes that are exacerbating already historic inequalities, especially with regards to control over land and other resources.
Thank you, Aasim. As I listened to Dr. Pasha's presentation, and then you know, key messages from Mary, from Dr. Faisal, and yourself, I gather the impression that the question is not stuck on inequality. It is that, you know, that's the status quo that we have inherited. In fact, the regression has gone down deeper. Dr. Faisal talks about narrowing on the mainstream, and you actually talk about increasing dispossession. So the question of two Pakistans, which Dr. Pasha's report and UNDP report also squarely kind of, you know, puts at the center of the debate, is not stuck on two Pakistans. When I listen to the three of you so far, I hear that the two Pakistans are also kind of moving in very opposing directions, where the fort Pakistan, the fortified Pakistan, is getting stronger, and the out of the fort Pakistan is shrinking, getting dispossessed, its space is narrowing down. And that certainly, there are a number of variables which need to be factored into the government's policy making. As we move forward, I want to come to Nazish Brohi, a powerhouse of a thinker, tackling you know, power, structural politics, and with a very clear eye on gender issues in Pakistan. She just concluded a fascinating study for UNDP Pakistan, in which she looked at the correlation of the gender divide in Pakistan and violence, specifically in the war on terror and counter-terror extremism paradigm. So some fascinating new trends that she's exploring. Nazish, women in Pakistan. I mean, the stereotype and the victimization paradigm is known to the world. We're the worst performing country on global gender index, you know, and that has been the headline news for the last few years. And yet in the last 10 years, we've also churned out a number of pro-women laws by the parliament. The labor workforce seems to be slowly but steadily increasing. And then now we do have women entrepreneurs, digital warriors, the Aurat March, successful 2 consecutive years. Is the tide turning, Nazish?
You know, I think I'm optimist. My optimism has reached, like, I think people often say it's terminal. So yes, I do think there are changes. I think changes are always not really linear. And I think that whatever trends we'll identify in society, there'll be people who will be able to identify counter trends. So there are always, I think, growth, change, of any kind is always a contradictory process. And, we don't linearly move point A to point B. And I think similarly in the case of women, there certainly have been changes, legislative changes. The usual critique handed out then is that we don't see these implemented, but it took us, 60 to 70 years to get the laws, and laws can only be implemented once they're there. So, it's in that sense, we move forward. Legislation has been done. We can talk about, the pitfalls of why it doesn't get implemented. But I just also want to talk about the kind of seismic shifts that have enabled these kind of legislative changes to happen. And, I think traditionally women had faced an ultimatum in Pakistan that you could either have membership of society or you could be a citizen of the state, and you really couldn't be both. So across parts of Pakistan, we saw women who, stayed within their communities, and then the state backed off and said it's an inter-community dynamic, whether they should stay alive or be killed for honor or be given property or be killed for asking for property, so on and so forth. And when women appealed to the state for protection, for various rights, the community backed off and almost kind of not just abdicated responsibility, but disowned women entirely. That if a woman went to, court kacheri nahi jati, aurtein thane nahi jati. So once they kind of approached these state institutions, you saw the community almost kind of disown them. And I think what we've seen in recent times is this kind of ultimatum is kind of collapsing. And now I see that women are able to, put their claims before the state while not necessarily having to then let go of the community. And I think that's a very significant moment that we are seeing. Whether it's, and I think that for the first time, women are establishing a relationship with the state that is not mediated through men. So for instance, there was a time that even something we now take for granted, such as the ID card, till about 50 years ago, in fact, more recently, 30 years ago, women's name was not on the identity card. It said, the wife of so-and-so and the daughter of so-and-so. So this thing of not just being named and photographed, but even, for instance, having the BISP card, where women just, feel a sense of connection and a sense of entitlement that they do have a claim on the state. I think that's an important kind of seismic shift, which follows, of course, another prior one, and that is the individual emerging as a sociological unit. And from a society such as we belong to, the collective was always the unit. Whether it was the family or the clan or the tribe, there was, even now, across rural Pakistan, I travel and I ask women, just a random question, how are things going, or what are you doing, whatever. My point is that they're unable to say the word I. They say, oh, we are doing well. We did this, or this bad thing happened to us. So the notion of individuality, which of course we can also, and there is a valid critique to it within the neoliberal paradigm, but the point is that the fact that a woman's welfare matters over and above that, the welfare of the collective, has changed things. And we see this manifest in laws such as, for instance, women who were often, for instance, given in marriage as a form of conflict resolution. Or a woman, who she marries. Marriage traditionally in Pakistan was a form of governance. Across rural Pakistan, whose water comes from where, who votes for whom, who tills the field together, who kind of shares the machinery. All of these things were traditionally mediated through marriage. So marriage was actually a governance paradigm in the absence of state. So when a woman then claimed the right to her body to be able to marry who she wants, it wasn't just about an individual right, it was actually collapsing a form of governance, which is why we see things like, honor killings suddenly emerging at a particular moment in time, or surging at least at a particular moment in time. And these things are gradually changing. I think what's I think what's happened in Pakistan is the economic system, or the base that kind of enabled the superstructure, or the economic system that created and sustained sociological rituals and practices. The economic system has shifted, but those sociological practices have outlived it. So as a result, those lots of social customs no longer make sense. They don't respond to a lived reality, because the kind of economic system that sustained it, that those conditions have changed, which is why I think we see a disconnect, a disjunct between, you know, old and the new things coming into clash. You know, younger women having very different opinions from older women, women as a whole having different opinions from the rest of their clan. So we see things having shifted. Is it enough? You know, is it enough to just assume that this is now on a forward trajectory? I would not say that at all. And there is, of course, a lot more to be done. But I think because these things, there are sociological shifts. And, you know, for instance, one thing in the UNDP report that was very heartening for me to note, and that was one of the slides Dr. Pasha shared in the beginning when he's talking about well, he's seeing it differently. He's talking about, you know, periods of high growth do not trickle down to the lower quintile earning a particular income, and that gets suppressed. And I actually would read it differently. And I think that slide was particularly interesting because I was looking at it from, you know, when Pakistan had a democratic dispensation and when it didn't. And what that slide and what the UNDP report shows to me is actually that democracy delivers to the poorest quintile. Because what we're seeing through this data is whenever there's a democratic government, we may not have very high growth, and in fact we don't. But what we do see is some kind of measures being taken for the poorest people. So I mean that's an indicator that as the system, as the democracy evolves, matures, as the system is allowed to evolve and mature, there are certain correctives that automatically come in, because a democratic dispensation cannot afford to ignore the poorest of the poor, and it does. It does, you know, so I'm not kind of excusing it. And Aasim Sajjad Akhtar Saab just gave us plenty of examples of the kind of dispossession that's happened even within a democracy. But having said that, I think the overall arc is when there are democratic dispensations, and it's a separate kind of argument about the quality of democracy and, you know, its hybridity. But when we do have elected governments in place, they are not as able to ignore the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. And, you know, vulnerability and exclusion aren't default modes. You know, they're not kind of conditions of status. We're not just the poor, or, you know, the people who've been identified, the demographic groups that have been identified in the report as the most marginalized. They're not just in a state of stasis. Marginality and vulnerability is maintained and perpetuated. So it's an ongoing cyclical thing. It's reinforced. And I think that the next thing we need to do is kind of break down things into those building blocks and see, like, you know, how, for instance, in this report that we're referring to, elite capture is broken down into tangible, quantifiable, you know, operationalizing components, you know, whether it's a taxation system or concessionary inputs or preferential access. So that explains to us how of the elite capture. And I think that when in this report, when we're talking about, you know, the component of people, we do have through this an understanding about who is being excluded, and we have an understanding of what they are being excluded from, such as representation, mobility, access to services, and so on and so forth. But what we don't have is how they are being excluded. You know, what are those kind of, how is it operationalized? Or what are the costs of exclusion? And I'd kind of like to kind of emphasize that point a little bit, that when people are excluded, there's a very high cost to it. And that cost may at one level be, for instance, you know, lower HDI indicators, but also more critically, it erodes public trust. When you have heightened inequalities, there's an erosion of public trust. And I think critical for a volatile country like Pakistan is it severs people's stakes from the governance system. And I think that's something we need to think about, that it's, as a country, we can't really afford that. Asad Umar Sahab, the minister, was talking about militancy, and, there are many other manifestations of this kind of grievance narratives. So what happens to a community or a demographic group that it feels like it's severed from the governance system and it no longer has stakes in it? I don't think those are the kind of experiments Pakistan can afford at all. I do also want to kind of, so I think that, part of, for instance, when this report is talking about, the 3 Ps of inequality, it's talking about people, but I think it's actually not. I think it's actually talking about a different P. I think it's talking about prejudice, because, when it comes to people, it's an old debate, people, I mean, I'm a little confused, personally at least, about calling people drivers of inequality. There is an old debate, of structure versus agency. So whereas we see people as suffering inequality, living through it, it's a lived reality for them. But I'm not sure if we can kind of, if I can at least with as much clarity say that they're also agents of inflicting that inequality. Because there is an agency question, is there a human agency involved in inflicting it, or are we talking about how structures bear in to create these kind of conditioned reflexes, which kind of, yes.
I want to, this latest point, and you've made a number of fascinating points. I was trying to keep up with you, but this last point that you've made, I want to draw in Dr. Pasha on this last point, that you are unable to reconcile or understand or accept people as a driver of inequality, because we look at, and certainly the speakers here on the panel have identified people as the victims of inequality. So then, Dr. Pasha, I want to take a few seconds to acknowledge our wonderful audience who've been putting in fascinating questions for our speakers also in the chat box. So many questions ranging from access to mobility for women, how that is an inequality metric, to a lack of understanding the topology of provinces like Balochistan when policy making is done, to not catering to highly educated youth who have lots of degrees but no jobs. The range of questions coming in from our audiences, and I would request our speakers to cast an eye and feel free to respond to those questions. But Dr. Pasha, this point from Nazish, I also am curious. Why did you choose to peg people as a driver of inequality rather than as victims of inequality? Then who are those people who are inflicting or creating inequality?
Okay, let me start off by saying that having listened to the wonderful panelists, and I must say they have made outstanding contributions, and I thank them for that. I had a feeling that perhaps we would want to invite the panel to participate in the second webinar on power, because the issues that have generally been highlighted relate to power. And I can see the extremely knowledgeable access to information and observation that we have in this wonderful panel of ours. And so I was feeling that maybe we should invite them once again for the power session. Now, you've raised this question of, is inequality a kind of product which happens in a sense more or less naturally due to the structural processes and dynamics of the evolution of economies and countries, or is it something which is actually caused through behavior and through participation by certain groups in society? Now, I will refer back to what Mr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar had said. And he referred to certain elites. He referred to, for example, the feudal elite, the military elite, the corporate elite, the privileged position of the state-owned enterprises, and so on and so forth. Now, surely many of the privileges that are enjoyed by these privileged, groups are not a natural consequence of so-called structural processes or perhaps even quasi-development. They are the result of blatant use of power and access. I mean, for example, you have a situation where tax privileges have been provided. And more recently, we have some sensational examples of tax privileges which have been provided, which I will not mention in the present budget. At a time when the government's mantra was, we are going to reduce tax exemptions, we are going to broaden the income tax base, we are going to ensure equity, so on and so forth, give long lesson on, given in the budget speech, bottom-up approach, and so on and so forth. The one or two of the most powerful parts of the power structure of Pakistan were given unprecedented tax exemptions. Now, this did not happen naturally. This was an exercise of power and privilege. So with all due respects, the corporate sector, the kind of benefits they're able to extract, the feudal elite, I mean, I'll give you one example. I mean, it's just a sensational example. How can the feudal elite who sit on top or at the mouth of the canal system in Punjab particularly, pay Abiana, which is hardly 1,000 rupees per acre and contributes only 8% to the recovery of the operation and maintenance costs of the water, the most important irrigation system, literally almost in the world. Now, surely this does not happen naturally. This happens because they're in a provision to extract their privilege. Why is it that with the 4,000 billion rupees of net income, the agricultural net income, the total revenue from it in Pakistan from the agricultural income tax is rupees 3 billion, 3 billion. Why? Because the rural elite dominates the provincial assemblies and the bureaucratic structure. So, you know, there are very clear explanations for the presence of privileges, which has nothing to do with the natural consequences of structural processes, but represent interventions in extracting privileges by vested interests. The fundamental question is, how can the power structure be changed to induce a degree of people's participation? Ms. Brohi made a very important observation that democracies do tend to be somewhat more participative in character and are able to bring about a degree of reduction in inequality. But even in the presence of democracies, you have ruthless exercise of power. And so even democracies have to evolve for us to be able to have measures of fairness in taxation, in access to land, in access to capital, in pricing of products, and so on and so forth. All these are instruments of extracting the surplus and enjoying privileges which are completely unjustified in the larger context of the people of Pakistan.
Thank you, Dr. Pasha. Very pertinent points. And I think you've given me a last big question. We've got 30 minutes remaining for our session. One big question that I want to put to our esteemed four panelists, Mary, Aasim, Nazish, and Dr. Faisal. Privilege. And of course, you know, the power structure has produced a set of privileges that are perpetuating inequality. In your view, and this is my question to each of our four panelists, quickly in 2-3 minutes each, what needs to be done to systematically and intentionally? I was really struck by Asad Umar's use of the word intention, policy making by intention. How could we intentionally systematically dismantle the existing privilege structure in Pakistan? Mary, first you please.
Thank you, Amara, once again. Let's start with accepting the fact that caste-based discrimination does exist in Pakistan. We have sufficient evidence to establish that inequalities exist, which arise out of people's perceptions and attitudes based on low caste backgrounds, as I mentioned before. And Pakistani state, which also practices very clearly, at least in sanitation sector, believing in caste system where job advertisements require only Christians or scheduled castes as sweepers, and society's denial to this issue, it's not helping. I have just finished a review of job advertisements published over the past decade, and its findings are very relevant to the inequalities embedded in the policies and the power structure. Let's accept that there is diversity. Let's extend human dignity to everyone by banning those caste-based name callings. Although the religious minorities, as I mentioned, those are very small in number, but they possess very strategic importance in Pakistan's foreign policy as well as our international human rights commitments. People at large believe that Pakistan is only for Muslims. And if they're not satisfied here, they should go back to their countries. And this is what this discourse needs to be changed. And I have said this before, and I'll say this again, to the people of Pakistan, we have not come from any other country, and please rest assured that we are not going anywhere. And last but not the least, let's give some attention to slum dwellers. They face multi-layered discrimination. They have been promised by the Constitution, particularly under Article 38A, as quoted by Dr. Pasha Saab, that improving living conditions of these marginalized minorities who are socially, economically, educationally, and politically at the lowest ladder of our social fabric. This is what the Constitution has promised, and this is what we expect from Islam's social justice system. Let's not leave.
Thank you, Mary. Social justice, very important concept and an antithesis to the structure of privilege and the refusal to pay for those privileges is at the heart of the subject. Dr. Bari, systematic cognitive dismantling of the privilege-based structure of Pakistan. Your thoughts?
This is a very difficult question. I've been struggling with this for at least in the education sector. And when I look at many other countries and historically, I find there are really the main route to mass education, at least, and therefore equality from in a very important sector that then has an impact on next generation and intergenerational inequality. In fact, one of the speakers talked about this intergenerational difference between women and how the more educated women of recent generations have a very different attitude towards life than the previous generation. So that obviously is an impact of partly of education. But in most countries that I've studied, this happened largely by a certain amount of elites realizing what national interest or whatever country interest in the medium to longer senses. So whether it be the mass movement for mass education in US, whether it be the post-industrial expansion in education in Europe and various countries within Europe, the Meiji sort of interventions in Japan, and the post-Second World War or after the in the 20th century interventions in some of East Asian countries, etc. A large part, this was not, none of these happened by, in some ways, grassroots movements that became large and changed. Rather, it was realization by the elites of what is required if they are going to create one, say, America, or if they are not going to be left behind by the rest of the world, say in Japan and Meiji and so on. It's either that, or it is then more a much more revolutionary movement that upsets the entrenched structure of the society, which we obviously have seen in certain countries. with less predictable sort of results in terms of outcomes for whatever that shakeup leads to. So those two seems to be the main sort of drivers of this kind of large change. Small change is not going to, so very small change that happens in every budget or in every sort of change of government, etc. Those to me are not enough to change some of these basic structures and challenge them. Now in Pakistan, the problem I've been having in education at least is, and it's a question that was put by one of the participants also, is why hasn't government been able to really make education sector much better, etc. Now you can have a lot of explanations in terms of elites having moved out of the public education or low-fee education and created their own walled schools and walled cities, exclusive enclaves and so on. That is there. But at the same time, why isn't the realization that the future of the country depends on extending education to everyone? Otherwise, we are in big trouble, and there's plenty of evidence now of that, that the way the job market and other things are changing, a large population, growing populations with young people who are uneducated or partially educated, those countries are going to have a very difficult time. Despite that, there seems to be very little realization on the part of the elites to actually extend that net of services to other people. So I don't have, I mean, this will sound pessimistic, but I, for the moment, don't have much hope from either the elites that they'll change the way they're working, or from grassroots movements, because I don't really see many of them developing that will lead to this change. Something unpredictable happening, that's the nature of unpredictable things. One can only hope that something does take place of that sort, but with some structure so that we are able to manage the process.
Thank you, Dr. Bari, very fascinating how you've kind of advanced the conversation to the question of scale of change. Aasim, I want to throw this ball to you. You know, looking at systems revolution versus top down, and then the level of change or the unpredictable, how do you dismantle privilege, which can reduce inequality?
I think, you know, everybody who's spoken till now has sort of, in a sense, answered that question. At least philosophically, what will end up happening in this country is hard to say. I think I agree with Faisal on that. I mean, I was reading one of the news reports that came out about your report, and that your the UNDP Assistant Secretary General Kani Vignaraja, and it was really interesting because she straight up says, and I quote, you know, she warned that it would take almost a social movement to displace structures of power that were so entrenched. Look, I think that there really isn't a shortcut. I hear sort of Faisal's slight pessimism. Well, of course, people like us who try and foment those kinds of sort of forces from below can't afford to be that pessimistic, no matter how difficult it appears at any given time. But I do share a certain sense of pessimism with regards to the story from above. I don't see any vision. I don't see any acknowledgement. You know, so the kinds of things that Mary is referring to, are we willing even in the intellectual mainstream to talk about caste, for instance? It's another thing to say, okay, do we have the political will to do anything about it? And that is frankly lacking. I want people from France colony in F74, which is a super rich, you know, part of Islamabad, to come and clean my house, but I'm not willing to contemplate the prospect of giving them proprietary rights to their literally one marla house. So I'm not, absolutely, I don't think that is around the corner. I hear what Nazish had to say. I think we probably all agree that as far as very molecular and incremental changes are concerned, there has to be, you know, in this country's history all told, and even including what you've mentioned in your reports, as as the military being one of the major stakeholders of elite privilege. You know, democracy, procedural democracy is part of the story. But nevertheless, you know, I think for me, when push comes to shove, there has to be something from below that compels and forces this change. I want to say one thing. You know, Dr. Pasha made it very clear that perhaps we should be talking about this in the politics session. But there is something about people here. So, you know, when we say people, people is this broad, sort of somewhat nebulous term. The elite we've talked about. I think what is crucial here is also this imaginary of development that the dominant imaginary. So if you have elite gated housing schemes that are generating dispossession and sort of contributing to elite privilege, I think the crucial story here is how that is marketed to the so-called middle class, right? And they want to be a part of that, that housing scheme. So they're looking up rather than down below to the segments that are being dispossessed. I think that's a crucial part of our story that we often neglect to think about. And I think that there's also something to be said for how even in the last 20 years, sort of the middle class miracle stories of growth and upward mobility, like the Chinas and the Indias. I won't speak so much about China. Look at next door in India. There's a report recently that 230 million people have been pushed below the poverty line since the pandemic started. So this mythical middle class that we are marketing development to is really, really very volatile and very vulnerable to be pushed down below from whence it came. And I think that part of this, that is the constituency, I think that is going to compel some kind of structural change, as I was saying earlier. Because otherwise, if it's just the dispossessed or the wretched of the earth, so to speak, that's hard to generate some kind of meaningful political voice. It's sort of this middle muddle that is taken in by wanting to be part of the elite that I think is the crucial X factor in thinking about how to generate a constituency for change.
Thank you, Aasim. Very pertinent as always. Last, before I go to Dr. Pasha for his overarching comment, Nazish, you seem to be the only optimist around the table. And if I dare say so, it is probably because of women's agency in Pakistan and how they're emerging as the game changers. And therefore, my question, game changers, growing agency, optimism, incremental power and access to power structures. And you raised the point of operationalization of people. So if women become powerful, and they are to whatever varying degrees, how do they resist and upholding the privilege structures? What do they essentially need to do not to fall in the pit, not to fall in the trap of privilege and power when they also gain agency?
So it's not, of course, possible to extract women as a demographic from what's happening in the rest of the country, and we everybody's now cognizant of what intersections mean. So women in the elite will have a very different experience from women from a poorer section of society versus women belonging to a particular ethnic group. So I don't think that I can kind of give you a prescription for women as a whole, because what's happening in the rest of the society is playing out very much in their lives as it is playing out on their bodies. And I will kind of reiterate Mary's point about, the extent of denialism. I mean, you begin to correct a problem by acknowledging that the problem is there. And that is as true for the condition of Christian minorities that Mary spoke about, as it is for, people who are disappeared from Balochistan. So I think the where you begin is by acknowledging there's a problem, and there is a power structure that kind of perpetuates those problems. And I think that's possibly a starting point. I do I do believe in incremental change, and I do think there's evidence to show that, however frustrating the pace of that change is, it is there. We have, of course, Pasha Saab has rightly pointed out about, the not just elite capture, but its parasitic nature. And of course, he's absolutely correct. But, these very feudals who are blamed have also, I think, an interesting, for instance, indicator for me is that there is no politician that I know of in Pakistan who has contested every election and has won every election, which means that even in their home constituencies, they've been defeated in one election or the other. I'm just kind of bringing that up to say that, there is actually very little autonomous power outside that of the state. So even when we're talking about these very powerful groups, whether it is the feudals or whether it is the multinationals or, whichever group you want to name, the power that they're capturing is actually the power of the state. So the feudal lords are no longer as they used to at one time. They don't have private armies anymore. The multinational corporations don't really function as the East India Company when there's an autonomous government in place. So my point is that they're working through the state. So it's actually state capture. And I think that might be a way of understanding conduits towards kind of dismantling this form of power, is actually looking at what parts of the state, or who is like, the state is really not a monolithic entity. We can only say that when we're outside. We do know it's a site of contestation, constant contestation. And I think maybe more and more people entering that battlefield of contestation and understanding that these systems, even the military, for example, I mean, it may look very hegemonic and, as a mountain standing from a distance, but, we all do know hegemony is never complete and there's always resistance. So I think just, zooming into the capillaries of power shows that power is always contested, and how do we kind of strengthen those contestations and enter the field? And I think that might be a place to start. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nazish, for that last wonderful rounding off. I turn to Dr. Pasha for a summation and any last pertinent observations or responses to the brilliant thoughts shared by our panelists. Over to you, Dr. Pasha, before I request Knut for a closure.
Okay, let me say that indeed, the quality of the discussion has been outstanding in character. And as I said, I wish we had an opportunity of also presenting to this particular panel our work that we did on the second P, which is the power P, and possibly also the third P, which is how policy making is influenced. And that is why it would be wonderful if we continue to have more or less the same panel for the rest of our webinars. We have come to the end of a fairly long, intensive discussion, and based on the assumption that we would want to continue with a similar panel, let me say that we have been familiarized very, very subtly and very effectively by certain dimensions of the play and exercise of power by this wonderful panelist group. And when I make my presentation in the next webinar, I will try and ensure that I begin to address some of those dimensions which have been highlighted, and also indicate what are the possibilities of change in the future. And let me tell you one last thing. I was particularly struck by a remark by Professor Bari about enlightened self-interest of the elite. This is a very profound point. And I do sense in some parts of the elite of our country a realization that if Pakistan is to survive and grow, that maybe the time has come for focusing on self-interest from the viewpoint of the larger interest. And that is precisely the kind of process that we should try and promote. And finally, let me say that one of the problems we always have, and people like me have had, is restrictions on the media. And it would be wonderful, and I request this to Knut, could he arrange, UNDP, a discussion of this kind on the media? Is UNDP willing to do this? It would be wonderful, and we all, the panelists and I, would greatly appreciate UNDP's role in ensuring a greater role, not only in the social media, but on television. Thank you, wonderful panelists, for your excellent, very, very subtle and precise contributions. I certainly have benefited enormously, and I will try and enrich the next session with some of the insights that I have gained from today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pasha. Before I request Knut to answer your big question on the next steps on our Pakistan inequality debates and possibly extending them to the mainstream media, I just want to thank my colleagues at the Development Policy Unit, UNDP Pakistan, and essentially the National Human Development Report team in my unit. As Dr. Pasha always rightly reminds, it's a national team effort. Really, they're the young people thinking, feeling, working hard to present this paradigm for this wonderful discussion today. So my sincere thanks to my team, and my sincere thanks to our wonderful participants who have been listening to this conversation, posing tough questions, important questions. I request our resident representative, UNDP Pakistan, Mr. Knut Ostby, to please present a vote of thanks and closing thoughts before we close today.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to everybody who has contributed. Of course, in the lead, the Minister Asad Umar and Dr. Hafiz Pasha, but also to all the panelists and the participants who provided a very rich set of questions. And many thanks also to the team who's worked for more than 1 year up to the time where we can actually roll out the thoughts presented in this report to engage people across Pakistan to dialogue about these issues. Because this is, as I said in the introduction, it's not the report itself that produces something. It is the process that it contributes to in Pakistan, the process of discussing what Pakistan would Pakistanis themselves want to see in the future. So to Dr. Pasha's question about media, I think part of that question goes without saying, that it makes sense to engage national media in this kind of dialogue. This has to some extent been done already by them reporting on the launch, by them reporting on other parts of the report. But I think Dr. Pasha is talking about a more direct, interactive kind of approach, and we should look into how we can organize that in a meaningful way that allows us to use that dimension to further the dialogue that we are proposing. The discussion today has been on many different topics. I think the contributors are mostly more knowledgeable than I am on these topics. So therefore, I shouldn't try to give a perfect analytical summary of what we have reached at. However, to pick up on a few points and draw on some points that I have on my mind, I think it's important to think in two dimensions. One is that you have on one hand inequality and restrictions on equal access to privileges, restrictions on equal access to services, etc. One issue is how to combat inequalities. But there is a different, or not actually different, but it's another angle to the same issue, which I think we do need to also keep equally much on our mind, and that is how people are empowered to positively claim their rightful part of society's services, their rightful ownership, equity of what public goods are available. And that, I think, needs to also be part of the debate, equally with the removing inequalities that we should create. Well, I could call it equalities, or create empowerment among people. And when the large groups of people are given choices, they're given the ability to claim what they need, what is their right, then that will very much drive the process. And as I said, convert people from being recipients of a limited amount of services to be contributors to the development of Pakistan, and that will, in addition to bringing them more into an equal position in terms of claiming services and public goods, it will also contribute very much to the development of the country. But of course, as I said, you all know this as much as I do. I think we did talk about bias, and we need to remove much of this bias to avoid that some groups are shut out of what they need. We need access to services, access to basic services. We need also to have a fair ownership of public goods. And as I mentioned already, the word privileges can be used in many ways. We used it mostly here in a negative sense. But if we think about privileges being accessible to all people across the country, it can also be seen in a positive sense. So I think we need to, again here, think in two dimensions, think that undue privileges is something that needs to be reduced, whereas privileges that go to most people is perhaps something we should seek for. So I think that's to some extent what I am able to say at the end here. We have our next webinar on the power dimension, and I think the discussion today did slip quite a bit into leading up to that discussion. And of course it's important, but because it all goes together, you cannot separate one pillar entirely from another. So I look very much forward to that discussion as well. And again, want to thank you very much for your contributions, for your provocative thoughts, from your ideas. And I'm sure that this and the following debates will help contribute to Pakistan's development as we are hoping. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Knut, for making that very useful distinction between privilege and undue privilege. Before we end today's session, may I request all our respected speakers to please turn on your camera. My communications colleague, Momina, has worked very hard for today's webinar, and she wants to take a final picture of all speakers for our Twitter. At UNDP Pakistan is UNDP's official Twitter handle, and today's webinar has been tweeted on that. The recording would be made available again on that on the Twitter handle, and please stay tuned on this space for our next forthcoming debates on power and then policy. On behalf of UNDP Pakistan, I thank our esteemed speakers, Honorable Planning Minister, Mr. Asad Umar, Dr. Hafiz Pasha, Knut, and Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, Mary Gill, Dr. Faisal Bari, and Nazish Brohi for your valuable time. And we look forward to engaging you consistently as we move forward to our next sessions. Special thanks to our participants. And with that, We wish you a pleasant day and a pleasant week until next time. Thank you very much.